I'm going to introduce you, Mike.
Go ahead, I'm going to grab some water real quick.
I'm sure I won't make it lengthy. I will not make it.
He needs to get a drink.
Oh, okay. I should say, I don't know when we first met, but he's the reason I lived down here, because I was living in Mount Holly, New Jersey, and Mike was involved with East Point Lighthouse, and that's sort of what brought me down here, down this way.
It was
late 80s.
It was architecture too. The brick somehow Quaker architecture. Didn't realize you end up here near the Watsons who also have an interesting thing.
Right. Yeah, I remember one of the first times I met him at the Mount Holly Meeting House, Quaker Meeting House, and he was eating a sandwich, munching on a sandwich, rotating, looking around at the meeting house at different architectural features, and I just had the feeling that he's seeing a lot more than I could ever see. He had a trained eye, so I've always respected that about Mike. Anyhow, he comes, born and raised in Audubon, so he's a South Jersey, genuine South Jersey guy, and he gave this talk actually at the Bayshore Center, I guess a year ago now. So it's a topic that will find its way into, or maybe it already has found its way into an article. So there will be an article on this later. And Mike was a long time involved with the Bayshore Center. So, and I live in Leesburg, so I feel real close to all of this. And just lately, I've gotten involved with some of you know about the farmstead, the group of 7 cabins in Bridgeton. He just met me over in Governor Prince Park in Essington, where the farmstead will probably be installed, and he was kind enough to help me think about that. So, I just wanted to, Brittany, if you could just say a couple of words about our latest publication. Like, if you don't mind, we'll do a little advertising.
We just processed and digitized our collection of the John G. Kaiser Civil War sketches. They're sketches he did while he served in the 24th New Jersey Regiment, Company H. We have them accumulated in the book. And also it includes a little book in the back of the 24th Regiment by James J. Reeves. It's our latest publication that is for sale for $29.95. So if anyone is interested, they're up for sale.
Thanks. There's eats afterwards, and there's also a little box in the back for contributions. We don't charge for this, but if you can throw in a couple of bucks, that'd be great. And okay, Mike, I guess that's it.
Thanks. This is going to be too much fun. I'm going to be a bad professor, and I'm going to start going off on tangents and just for a second here. Actually, one of the first times I met Joe was when Joe was a young preservation zealot trying to get a Woolman house preserved in Burlington County. And remember you gave that presentation at the Rancocas Meeting House. And Joe went into the, talk about the lion's den, because these farmers aren't terribly romantic there about their landscapes. They were looking to make some big time money. And that was a courageous talk, Joe. Because Joe's basically trying to appeal to their sort of moral obligations to preserving landscape in South Jersey, and they're looking at him like, who is this guy? What's he talking about? My land's worth $2 million. No.
It was the house where John Woolman, the Quaker autobiographer, was born and raised.
The actual house, right?
Yeah.
As opposed to the one in Mount Holly that everybody thought was his house. And,
yeah. So it's torn down, and now it's a trucking outfit, right? Isn't that what it is?
But my name is Michael Chiarappa, and I'm a history professor at Quinnipiac University. As Joe pointed out, I'm from southern New Jersey, and my father had a truck route all around South Jersey, so I think that's one of the reasons as a boy I got intrigued with. My dad was from the Bronx, my mother's from Haddon Township, and so my father didn't have much. If you knew my father, he definitely did not have an orientation to South Jersey, particularly its rural landscapes, that intrigued me immensely. And so I was always driving him crazy in the truck, looking at things and asking him questions, to which he would yell at me and tell me to basically shut up and wait till we get to the next stop. And my grandfather, who was from Haddonfield, he loved South Jersey, he loved the Bay, he loved Delaware Bay, he loved the Atlantic coastline, and so I used to go fishing with him a lot and got to know places. And so, that seed was planted, and over the years it just kind of grew, and I was fortunate to go to grad school, and then I got to meet the Watsons, Bob and Penny, or I'm going to pick them up, singling them out. Now they've been great friends and colleagues over the years, and their mother, if you knew Sally, she once had me. I basically was sort of in charge of the John Du Bois Maritime Museum, and it was great the way Sally kind of got me to do that, because it was kind of like, if you know the way Sally was, she was hard to say no to. It was the way she said, she didn't put that pressure on me, she just kept saying, I think you'd be really good at that. It was like being with a teacher, actually. I think you should do this project. And you're thinking, well, I want to do this project, but I think you'd be really good at this. And so but I was happy because I had a good time, and I used to have a good time with Mrs. Watson. We had some good chats together about her experiences as a preservationist and as a local historian, and I enjoyed that. I'm a cultural and environmental historian, and as you can imagine, when you do that sort of thing, that's a pretty broad rubric. But when I do my research, I focus heavily on the Middle Atlantic region, and Joe was talking about articles. I'm on sabbatical right now, and I'm supposed to be working on this environmental history of the Delaware Bay oyster industry, which is what I just had to finish up. If you've done any publication, edits on 2 articles, one for an encyclopedia, which is kind of a thankless task on one level. I'm sorry, that's on camera. But the other one's actually an article that I did on African Americans who worked on the Delaware River and Delaware Bay, which is going to be in buildings and landscapes for all you vernacular architecture people, of which Warren and Joe were very helpful in helping me with some visual materials for that. So again, the Cumberland County Historical Society is near and dear to my heart. This presentation today is something that happens to any of us, I think, who do history research, and I think you all can probably relate to this when you're working on a particular project, and you've got a particular focus and agenda, and all of a sudden you're going through materials and you say, wow, this is interesting. It has nothing to do with what you're working on. Like, oh, you're like a kid in a candy shop. Oh, this isn't. And so over the years, though, this isn't necessarily a departure, but because I do a lot of work with material culture, artifacts, architecture, vessels, watercraft, I'm always interested in depictions of them, of course. And photography, particularly of those eras, is very useful in my research. So it's not just, as we like to say, it's not just eye candy. There's actually academic rigor to this. And if I use a few terms today that sound too academically jargon-esque, I'll back up for a second and explain what I mean. So over the course of doing my research on the Delaware Bay and its various fisheries and enterprises that use the resources of the bay, I've discovered a variety of photographers. And I always said to myself, this would be a really nice publication or book because it's visual, it would appeal to a general audience. And so I'm hoping to do something with this. And so you folks are one of my trial audiences. I gave a presentation on this material at a New Jersey History Conference where, unlike this venue, if you've ever, and I'm sure some of you have, you've ever been at a conference where the people ahead of you take up more time than they should, and you're ending up with 5 minutes when you should have had 15, that's what happened. So I'm like, they're trying to cut me off, and I'm saying, hold it, where's my 15? I've got material here. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about that today. I want to set some context here, okay? I hope I don't come off as too teacherly in all this, but one of the things we do as historians, aside from just, and again, I'm not trying to disparage anybody who's not a professional historian, it's not just about facts and trivia. It's about understanding how pieces fit together, right? Understanding context, understanding relevance. And so some of the themes that are informing how I'm handling this photographic material I've been researching are things like photographers who engage in work because they're feeling nostalgic, they're feeling antiquarian. We all have that, right? In fact, I often say that to my students. In fact, I have to confess, there are times I find certain topics fetching because it kind of tugs at my heartstrings. That's on camera too, right? I get to see my colleague right now. He had all those conversions. Good. But I often say to my students, if that's what draws you in, I'm happy. Now we have to take it to another level. We move from that initial visceral response that you have, that kind of, whether it's antiquarian, romantic, or nostalgic. Now let's start getting a little more analytical with the material. So that's an issue, how these photographs kind of fit into that tradition. Romantic regionalism, that's a phrase that I use, but the reality is, if you folks know anything about larger trajectories of history in Europe and in the United States, throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, the world underwent a lot of transformation. And what happens is that people respond sometimes, and they're for a variety of reasons. Sometimes it's emotional, sometimes it's kind of this excavating kind of mentality. Well, we better save this stuff before it's gone. And that becomes a big driving force behind a lot of history, that's practiced. And if you ever wondered why New England's museums and historical societies have a certain entrenchment, that's because New Englanders were some of the first people to really kind of hunker down on their genealogy and their history. And the reason they were doing it wasn't terribly virtuous at times, and being half Italian, half Irish. A lot of it was nativism. It was a response to immigration. These folks felt like, oh gosh, these people are going to change America in irreversible ways. We better get our pedigree down and shore up. The problem is all groups do this. It isn't just folks in the United States. We see all cultures throughout the world, which leads to a lot of course, unhealthy sentiment. Commercial objectives. A lot of photography, of course, comes of age when we're getting into modern advertising and tourism. Today we call it cultural tourism, historic tourism, ecotourism. Popular history making, this kind of ties in. Folks get interested in doing history as a hobby, and this ties in with genealogy and local museums. And again, there's nothing wrong with that. It's very important. When I teach public history, which means when I teach museum studies and I teach courses to my students on the undergraduate and graduate level, I always say, you folks would appreciate this because I don't know how many professional historians are in the audience. It's like there are some people, and maybe you've run into this, I'm an academic, and sometimes academics look at amateurs or people who do it as a hobby, they kind of like pat you on the head and say, that's nice. And I say, that's not a good thing to do, right? A physician wouldn't say to a good patient that you're eating well, you're taking your vitamins, you're exercising. They wouldn't say that's nice, they'd say that's great. I'm glad you're educating yourself. I always say, as a public historian, you really need to be in sync because those folks are doing research that you're not doing and that you will not have the opportunity to do. And sometimes they're engaging in detail and finding things out. I've worked with people, some unlikely partners throughout my career. I don't write off anybody who could be a potential colleague and helpmate in doing my research, but some people do. So the popular history makers. I'm sorry, this is from an academic conference, but vernacular ethnography. Basically, a lot of people become sort of amateur anthropologists, and you're going to see this in some of the images in particular, one in particular that I've really gotten my teeth into. I'll get excited seeing that. But that's people who just become really intrigued at their local culture. They're not necessarily historians, but they're interested in what's going on in their community. So they're sort of like amateur anthropologists. And some of this ultimately, some of the later photography I'll show you ties in with environmental politics and policy and so forth. Of course, if you know anything about these images that William J.S. Bradway, he was a Salem County fellow, but he kind of straddled that line between Cumberland and Salem County and did a lot of interesting stuff on that. So, when we look at these issues of, what does it do? What does this photography do? Once it's in circulation, as many of you know, certain photographers, like a lot of visual artists, when they create certain images, they really do shape perceptions that have sometimes very constructive outcomes and sometimes a little more problematic. If you talk to people in Monterey, California, which was known for its sardine industry, fascinating history. But some folks there get a little miffed because they feel like John Steinbeck's book, Cannery Row, that's a depiction. And so photographers, have an impact. What photographs are interesting in doing is they kind of, particularly older photographs, is they really kind of touch a chord in us in terms of our sentiment regarding the roots of an area, the mythic roots of an area. And sometimes when you look at some of these photographs, you'll see how they link in with commercial ambition and so forth. Here's some of the photographers, just to give you a little inventory of who I'm working with right now. William J. S. Bradway, who I just mentioned, Harvey Porch, whose collection of materials is housed here. Cora Sheppard Lupton, who was a recent discovery. And I think, Shepard's here today? No, they're not here. But I'll talk a bit more about that. Daniel Ward and Emerson Garrison were both photographers at commercial studios in Bridgeton and produced a lot of photographic postcards. And if you know what a real photographic postcard is, it's a very crisp image that's made directly from the negative. And there was this real golden age of real photographic postcards between essentially 1900 and 1915. So that's a lot of the great images that we historians use come out of there. Graham Schofield, if you're from the Bridgeton area, you know he was the one-time owner and editor of the Bridgeton Evening News. And he was from Philadelphia originally, worked in Florida. I'll give a little more background on him later. H. Armstrong Roberts was a commercial stock photographer. And we're not going to look at any of his stuff today, nor of William Augustine's, but H. Armstrong Roberts operated a studio out of Philadelphia, and I don't know what's happened to his images, but he was one of America's premier stock photographers and did a lot of photography in southern New Jersey. So his studio actually was right across from where I lived in graduate school for a while at 42nd and Locust in Philadelphia. William Augustine followed Henry Charlton Beck around South Jersey and did a lot of photography for him. And his materials that still exist are up at Rutgers, New Brunswick. And Arthur Rothstein was a New Deal photographer, part of the Resettlement Administration, Farm Security Administration photographers who went out and documented conditions. As you know, the New Deal, one of their projects was to remedy some of our problematic agricultural practices in the past, and a little bit beyond that as well. Social conditions that were also attached to rural communities. And so these, you probably heard of Dorothea Lange and Walker Evans and so forth. And Rothstein didn't have their cachet, but he was ambitious, so he got out and did a lot of work. And we're going to talk about a few, syndicated photographs of the Acme collection in just a second. I'm sorry this images aren't a bit crisper here. I hope you can. But this is a crew not being photographed by Graham Schofield, but by one of his friends in the 1930s, and this is Fortescue. Any of these photographs that I show you today, when I talk about context, you should understand that they're really part of a movement that's afoot when this is all going on between 1900 and 1895 and 1940, which means there are other people who are kind of a part of this. They may not be friends, although Dallas Lord Sharp was actually friends with one of the photographers, but they were all part of a cadre of people who were all interested in local stuff, good stuff, the local culture, the local people, the local ways of life. And Dallas Lord Sharp, do you folks know Dallas Lord Sharp? Yes. I'm going to hate to engage in hyperbole here, but I will. I've been in contact with one of his descendants, and those folks are making some inroads with folks down in Morristown right now, Morristown Historical Society. Because Dallas Lord Sharp was born in Haleyville. And then I believe his father dies, his mother remarries, and they move up closer to Bridgeton. They actually live closer to Rosetown, kind of in between Bridgeton and Rosetown. And he's some kind of modest background. And he goes on, he goes to Brown University, becomes an ordained Methodist minister, and then he gets a job teaching writing at Boston University. And this man was one of how he has slipped through the cracks of history, literary and historical, is beyond my comprehension, because at one point in 1914, 1915, he was the most sought after and the most highly purchased author of nature writing in the country. And rather modest in many respects. And his whole cachet is, of course, you can be a great naturalist if you just look out in your backyard. And so his first book, Wildlife Near Home, of course, you can't read it here because of the projection, but that kind of set the tone for the rest of his life. And he was also an educator. He was very involved in the Nature Education Association. He was nationally connected, arguably internationally connected. So he was a pivotal character. So he kind of ties in with all this because he had this sentiment for South Jersey. And if you go through all of his books, even when he's not dealing with South Jersey, boy, he'll throw a South Jersey, there'll be a little line in there. If you know South Jersey, particularly Cumberland County history, you know what he's talking about. Lupton Pond, Bear Swamp. He's mentioning places that a local would recognize. So he fits in with all this. Cornelius Wagon, who, again, was a professor at the University of Pennsylvania, but he got around, New England, but particularly Pennsylvania, southeastern Pennsylvania, and also South Jersey. And so he ties in with this in his book, Down Jersey, of course. It's, again, corresponding to this era that I'm talking about. So, and of course, Henry Charlton Beck as well. This is one of his photographs that, again, we'll get a new projector. We'll do this if everyone sees it. This was actually taken at Bayside. And this is Wyatt Miller alongside of his colleague. And they're obviously tending some shad nets right there.
Would it help to turn down the lights?
I don't know.
I think it would, if you turn this big light, just turn it on to see if it makes the
he's doing it right now.
Let's give it a shot. It would give us a little bit more.
Actually,
Unlike my students, I'll say hopefully that ties in with this, of course, is motor tourism. So these photographers are kind of tied into this network as well. This is a great booklet that I found that was put out in 1926 by the Philadelphia Bulletin. And again, Cumberland County residents be happy to know that 2 of the featured tours dealt with this area. Coming down on the Bay Shore and going more to the Greenwich area, but they also directed folks to go down to Port Norris and, of course, this kind of industrial tourism. Back when you could actually do industrial tourism, we don't do that anymore after 9/11. Well, we were actually not doing it a little bit before 9/11, but if you recall, there were days where industry loved to get people on site to see what was. I remember going through the River Rouge plant when I was a freshman in college. Nowadays, that stuff's hard to do. So let's get to some of the photographers and some of the things that some images and. He dealt with a view camera, a large view camera, and glass plate negatives, and so there's limitations to that, right? You have to set up. It's not as you can't be as nimble as with the more modern, portable cameras. But he did great stuff, and he didn't just do the Delaware Bay, although that's what I'm focusing on in this presentation. He did lots of great imaging. This is one of his business cards right here, but he was involved in all kinds of photographic work. And he was a farmer. He was a Sunday school teacher. I mean, he did it as sort of an avocation, but he was good. He had a good eye. And again, as a cultural historian, I'm always intrigued at people who have that innate sort of sensibility that this local material is good, that it's worth documenting. So, like this image in Hope Creek, this was an image years ago that I found this, I actually made this copy neg off of a real photograph. That's a shad skiff with some shad in it. It's possible that that negative is owned by Lower Eloise Creek Township. They own his negatives, the actual township does. And this is a famous scene every year during shad season where you have sort of all these fishermen arrive with their cabin scows or cabin, floating cabins. There's one now by Hancock's Harbor that's been restored, and these were everywhere. I mean, people often ask me, "Oh, are they unique to this?" Well, they were kind of up and down the Atlantic coast. They were on the bay. You don't see them so much in the Delaware River, but you also see them on the Chesapeake as well. It's just a small scow with a little shack built on top of it. So he's obviously onto that. Tending to the nets. And this is a fabulous shot, of course. I'm very interested in watercraft. That's what my bias is going to show here. But those are shad skiffs. They might also call them a sturgeon skiff if they made them a bit longer to accommodate harvesting a bigger fish, which a sturgeon is. But that's a great image. And of course, the trapping scenes. And I'm sure some of you have seen these images before. So my point being is that. Like a lot of folks of this era, who got interested in photographic documentation, Bradway, he's kind of an amateur anthropologist on top of it all. He's making money. He's selling these images as well, of course. But you know, some people know they know the good material to focus on. That's important. But I always like to tell people, you know, we all take photographs with intentionality, with an agenda, right? We're not just shooting. I mean, some people are crazy. They're out there like, you know, carpet bombing everything with their camera. But a lot of people, you're taking an image because you've got a particular message that you want to convey. It's a communication device. So, Harvey Porch, of course, was one of the first photographers I was kind of, you know, really involved with because I do so much work on the Delaware Bay oyster industry, and Porch did a lot of documentation. Now, what's interesting about Porch is that, compared to some other folks I'm going to show you, is he was using a large view camera, and he was doing more land-based stuff. So he did a lot of great photography, but he doesn't really get out in the boats very often. This is a famous image right here, and of course, his images were made into postcards, which some of you may have. And of course, his collections are here. So he's got a number of things going, but he's also a part-time, you know, well, he's not part-time. He was a postman. You know, he delivered mail, which is interesting because someone else we're going to talk about also delivered mail. So I'm not sure what it is about postman and mail delivery that kind of corresponds with their interest in photography. But he wanted to make money, and he. You know, these are some of the famous images, of course. I mean, great. I mean, you can see that those large negatives give you clarity and they give you detail. And for some of you folks, if you want a little bit of a tutorial, I mean, these are oyster scows. See, when the oyster boats came in, they deposited their oysters in these floats, and then they sat in there for anywhere from 12 to 24 to 48 hours, kind of purged themselves of sand and other sort of gritty material, and they freshen. When they're in brackish water and not such the saltier water of the bay, they fatten up a bit, and that was a marketing tool as well. And they would move them from the floats to the scows, and then from the scows into the actual wharves, and then they would ship them out by train. Porch obviously had a lot of work in Bivalve, because this is a picture of his studio in Bivalve. So you gives you some idea of the fact that he could actually, this is not Porch, this is his studio here, but this is a great image here, obviously, and the image with the garb on the horse to deal with the flies that we all know that are near to our bay shore. It's a great image, and I put it in there to show you that obviously when the oyster industry was in its heyday, there was, you know, enough action to warrant Porch actually having a shingle out in front of the studio there. So. He did Porch did a lot of work for New Jersey government reports of a variety of sorts. Agricultural reports, the shell fisheries reports. So you find his images in a number of locations. This is kind of a famous image. Actually, this image, which you have here in your collection, but it's also, if you go to the National Archives in Philadelphia, they have a bunch of these because at one point they were trying to convince the Corps of Engineers to open up Morris River's, mouth a bit more, and they sent all these images to make their case of it. And these are all, again, images that exist here in the collection that folks, have access to. And if you like old baskets like I do, you like that image, the oyster baskets. Again, the government reports that were used, the postcards, give you some idea there. Just again, he kind of covered the full gamut. Probably, I would say with Porch, there was no one who documented the oyster landscape, the more terrestrial elements of the industry as much as Porch did, which is fascinating.
What's that building on the?
This is a house.
Someone's house.
Yeah, at Bivalve. And that was actually in a government report, and then the caption read, "Typical oysterman's house." Which, if you know anything about the spatial dynamics of Bivalve, there was if you lived in Bivalve, again, I'm not saying this judgmentally, but the idea was it was a more hard-scrabble existence if you lived in Bivalve. Once you made it, you moved downtown Port Arthur. But a lot of folks, of course, when the resource was prolific, you could, and this was a great first start for a lot of people. So, and these are oyster timers. We didn't have tonguing on the Delaware Bay, it wasn't, we were more of a dredge-oriented oyster industry, but you could, and the rules were a bit more lax with tongers because the logic being that these folks were not going to obviously take as heavy a toll on the resource as the dredges would. Porch did a lot of photography at Fortescue, and that's not surprising because I always refer to Fortescue as Cumberland County's beach resort. I get so bummed out at the erosion there because if all this research I've done over the past 20 years, it's clear that Fortescue really had a special place in the hearts of Cumberland County residents. It was kind of their place. Now, didn't mean that my grandfather and great-grandfather came down here all the time, but I think the Cumberland County people, they saw this as their place. Again, they advertised in Philadelphia, so it wasn't isolated in that sense. But Porch spent a lot of time. A lot of companies and families had reunions here. And so you got a lot. You really do see this orientation towards the county, and again, Porch did just some great, just great stuff. I mean, capturing really the sentiment and the energy of this location. Oops, sorry, real fast there. We can go back. There we are. Now, just a quick survey of, again, Ward, Daniel Ward. So, and one of the ways in which over the years for those of you folks, Ward uses this font for his photography. So that, and again, he's doing images, and again, advertising. You look at the old Bridgeton newspapers. When he comes out with a new set, he's alerting the public, come by my studio and buy the latest. See, because people used to trade these. You might have a pen pal, in Omaha, Nebraska. You'd send me the latest images you have, blah, blah, blah. So people would trade cards, like baseball cards almost. It was really fascinating when this era of the real photographic postcard came out. This is a great scene right here for you folks. Cedarville, there it is. And I love this scene because, again, I'm sorry, I'm veering here, folks, but I got to tell you why it's here. But when you see this is interesting. Where's Bob Watson? We didn't meet Bob Watson. This is called a poor man's dry dock. It's, when oftentimes, when you wanted to work on a boat and you didn't want to haul it out, you'd wait till low tide and you might take, anchors or a series of block and tackles and pull it to the side and work on the boat rather than actually going all the lengths of having it hauled out on a railway. So this is a great image. Also, this will just happen at low tide anyway, but that's something that they did as well. So I often use this image to explain to students if somebody needed to get to a leaky plank down in here, and that was when they would do it. And Garrison, of course, another photographer, and again, a lot of similar images. It's like he and Ward were both kind of competitors in their own right. People in the postcard community, of course, go crazy on this. Whoa, sorry about that. This has been my most recent find. I shouldn't say recent because it's now been over a year and a half. And to say that that this has me incredibly charged up is to put it mildly. And I'm not. A friend of mine, a conservative friend of mine once said, he once made a statement about, he said, are you one of these historians and everything comes back to women's history? I said, oh, geez, coming up with I said, well, they weren't included in the record for a long time, so we do have some amends to make, some offenses to mend. But this isn't the case. I mean, just a second. I won't tell you the whole circuitous route by which I found out about. I knew about Cora Sheppard Lupton, Cora June Shepard as she's known. I knew about her beforehand, but the photographs I did not. And this one was fascinating. She was a friend of Dallas Lure Sharp. She went to the South Jersey Institute, and the more when I found the photographs, it really prompted me to get into her background. And I've said to some family members who are related to her, I said, you know what? She and Archibald Lupton, who was her husband, I believe they either divorced or separated later, and it starts to make some sense because Cora June Shepard was not your typical woman of the era. She looks, of course, every bit the sort of woman of that era, but she was progressive. In fact, I asked some family members about it. They said, oh yeah, she was different. She was, and she worked with her husband doing photography, but she was a prolific author. She wrote for agricultural journals. She wrote for hunting and fishing journals. So she, in spite of her garb, she was writing mix. I mean, this woman who got out in the dirt with the farmers, was down at Bayside, was down at Bivalve, and she was doing the interviewing. I'll let the photographs do the speaking. This is some here at Seabreeze right here camping. Camping at Seabreeze and at Fortescue on the Bay, believe it or not, was popular. Somebody, any postcard collectors. I got outbid on a tent scene at Fortescue, which recently on eBay, but this was a big deal on the Bay. It was people camping out, and that's her right here. Probably Archibald Lupton took that image of her.
Her brother was responsible for the tea burning monument.
Her brother. That wasn't her father, was it?
No, it wasn't her father, it was her brother.
Her brother?
My mother grew up across the street from her in Shiloh.
Oh, okay, good. So you know a bit about her then. Of course, as you can see, she got around to these various locations where, I guess I should put some clarity, a lot of women hung out at Bayside. I mean, it was a fascinating place in its day. Thank goodness for her, I mean, whether it was at Bivalve, at Port Norris, but it's the stuff that she did really closer to this area that's fascinating. She and her husband, who worked together collectively on the photography. And again, hauling around glass, a lot of photographers of this era who worked with glass plate negatives did work together because it's a lot of work, just the weight of the camera and of the glass plate negatives in particular when you're doing work in certain areas. It's just, you need help. You need an assistant. So it's easy to...
When did glass negatives go out? What year?
Oh, gosh, that's a good question. My guess is probably by the, at least probably by the end of the teens, 1920. My guess is based on when the stuff that I've been exposed to, but I'm not exactly sure.
Was her husband a member of the Bridgeton Camera Society?
Not that I know of. That's not saying he wasn't, but...
Because that's part of the reason they made the society was the chemicals were expensive, it was difficult, and they made the society so that they pooled their resources.
Right. Now, Graham Schofield was a member. Most people...
So was Garrison.
Yeah. And that camera society goes back quite a ways.
1880.
Yeah.
Started out bicycles.
Yeah, right. Are you involved in it? Is it still in existence?
No, it was only 100 years.
Yeah, I mean, I've got some documentation on it, some of the early materials, and actually quite surprising. I was surprised it was as early as it was. What was the building? The Goldberg?
Well, two different buildings.
Goldstein? What building was
The first one was on Commerce Street, above Sidney Bowen's pharmacy, which the gallery is now. And the second one was after the, darn, I can't think of the name, but when they built the Feinstein building after Grosskopf burned down, they put the Camera Society above that, and it was built to order.
Right, yeah. I think I know who you are. You're from the area, right? Tell me your name, ma'am.
My name's Joan McAllister, but I'm interested
Joe,
in photography.
no, you're not the woman. Well, maybe you are the woman. There was somebody else that was, it's a long story, but I'll tell you more.
But I couldn't see them letting her in. That's why I asked if her husband was a member.
It could be. Again, these are the gaps, that inevitably, these all men clubs are kind of interesting.
Yeah.
That's, well, this is why she's fascinating. But this is, an example more of the photography, This is Bayside during the shad harvest. This is Bayside fixing nets. Of course, as you know, this is all gone now, which is why this record. Now again, the information that I have is that she worked collaboratively with Archibald Lupton, which again is not uncommon. I knew male photographers who typically work together because due to the constraints of hauling the equipment around. But this material is absolutely phenomenal, as you can see. Again, another Bayside scene. There's a sturgeon being lifted out of one of the skiffs. There's a trapping scene. The stuff is just like. And again, here's the example. These are the articles. Now, one of the problems that drives me crazy that one of my librarians at the Quinnipiac is going to work on for me. See, a lot of the stuff that she published, she didn't put her name to it, and so she contributed to the Philadelphia Inquirer. She contributed to some national newspapers, but it just said a correspondent. Now, some things she does, identify herself. But as you can imagine, a lot of women during this year didn't necessarily go down and hang out with the trappers and the shad fishermen. So I just, as we like to say, I admire her moxie. Graham Schofield, and again, if you're from the area, Schofield, he, his legacy in the area. Schofield was an interesting guy. He was a newspaper man, but his particular niche in the industry was advertising, and he would have made no bones about this. He wasn't so much writing. He was, a lot of people in the newspaper industry have their niches, but for somebody like Schofield, who became this adopted son of Cumberland County and running a prominent newspaper and having his weekly lunch at the Cumberland Hotel with the rest of the boys. There was a photograph years ago that I saw that a family member showed me, and there was Graham, and there's so-and-so, and there's so-and-so, and so it was a male gathering. Of course, one of my students once said to me when we were doing field work, she said, "This is a very male space," was her line. I said, "Yeah, I feel intimidated here." I said, it was in a shipyard. That was her line. She was great. She was a very male space. I said, yeah. Schofield, of course, since he was in advertising, he was, acutely aware of the power of imagery. And the reality is that America's fisheries were having problems back in the 1860s and 1870s and 1880s. The nostalgia that we often hear about today regarding, the problems with overharvesting and other environmental problems, they've gone back for years. And so the age of sail and the romanticism is never lost on people. And of course, Schofield, once he's down here running his newspaper, and once he becomes really the chief editor and has that kind of agency, that ability to dictate formatting in a much more proactive way of the newspaper, well, he gives a lot of play to the oyster industry. He was also interested in history. He was on a number of statewide committees that were involved in doing New Jersey history. So, he was dialed in, as we say today, or young people like to say. He was, but it's also clear that he knew the age of sail was coming to an end. And boy, during the 20s and 30s, boy, he gave the industry a lot of play. There you go right there. The Feinstein building, that's it right there. That's what I was trying to remember, the Feinstein building, where they had some space for their exhibitions. Schofield actually won a number of statewide prizes through his photography, and here's one of their juried exhibitions right here. So he's got this artistic sense. He's more of, I have to say, again, he wouldn't have claimed that he was an artist, but he really had more of an aesthetic sense. So he did some great imagery of the industry. This is during Bay season. This was not during your R months. When you see all these boats that congested, what they're doing is they're harvesting seed oysters for transplanting and trying during the months of May and June, or one time April, May, and June. And Schofield, he, every year he organized trips. Since he was part of the local business community, he could always get on a boat, and later on, he got on the state watchboats, and he would organize trips of other journalists from around the state and take them on board, and take people from the Camera Society, probably no women, at least I've never. In some of his photographs, he actually photographs the photographers, and unfortunately there's no women in this photograph. So, but he's, again, he's involved in journalistic circles throughout the state, and so his photographs get a lot of play. Again, he's involved in the Camera Society, so his stuff is also exhibited. So, but really, it's amazing if you look at, what's going on, particularly during the 20s, because that's, of course, the last oyster schooners built in 1930, and then, of course, the Depression hits. But there is an incredible bevy of oyster schooner construction between roughly 1918 and 1930, and boy, Schofield's there for every inch of the way. He's getting it all down. When he's not on the water, and again, he goes out in the boats, or he's, again, taking photographs of his fellow colleagues. But he's also at the yards, you know, and getting these last images down, which are really phenomenal for any of us who study, you know, regional watercraft, schooner and sloop construction. You know, if you go to the old, you know, copies of the British Navy News, you'll see these images there. This is the state watchboat, the Furman Reeves, being built, and once that was built, that was sort of like, and that was built in the late 1920s. That was even better because you could really entertain a party of dignitaries. The governor would go out on it, the state senators and state assemblymen would go out on it, and so it was quite the platform for giving folks exposure to the industry, and Schofield went to great lengths to, again, focus energy on, particularly during bay season. See, during bay season, you could actually, not far from here, actually see the boats, or, this is another reason why Fortescue became popular. You could actually, during bay season, take a nice picnic lunch and go out and watch all the boats. So that Fortescue was a great staging area for watching the harvesting of seed oysters during the spring months. And I'm sorry, that image was already dark and now, but for those of you folks who remember old Albertson Huber, that's him right there. As a young man, he was the one of the state engineers who surveyed the oyster grounds, and so it's not surprising that he was on the boat and that Schofield took this image. And but Schofield wasn't above also taking images of some of the grunts here, and this is a great image because that's a shipmate. If you worked in the commercial fishing industry, this was the standard, you know, the blue ribbon cook stove that you had on your boat, and that had a little rack around the side to keep your pans from slipping off when you were cooking. And so I kind of like the fact that this is rare. Schofield didn't do a lot of images like this, but the fact that he caught this gentleman, it's a pity that a lot of these aren't identified. This intrigued me. I came upon a collection of images that were collected and taken during the 1930s when, you know, New Jersey and Delaware over the years, as you know, Delaware's boundary, if you start in Newcastle, Delaware, and draw a circle, that the boundaries of Delaware actually come up to the New Jersey shore. We don't split the bay or the river in those areas. If you're in areas of Salem County, you're on the low water mark. You'll see a little U.S. Geodetic Survey marker there, and that it says Delaware and New Jersey, and you're literally standing in both states, although you feel like you're in Salem County. And what happened was there was often a lot of contention over were we on Delaware's oyster grounds, even though they didn't have the oyster grounds that we did. But it got contentious. Also during this time period is there was renewed discussions about diverting water from the Delaware estuary up in New York State, which, believe it or not, has ramifications for salinity levels down in the bay. And so there was this all went to that went to the Supreme Court. So did the Delaware boundary dispute went to the Supreme Court. So a lot of this was in the news. And so, you know, groups like, you know, today would be the UPI or, you know, the Associated Press, Acme Photographs, the News Enterprise Association sent their photographers out. So this is great because, I mean, it kind of did a real thorough survey of everything from, you know, provisioning up to actually going out in the boats and watching the dredging taking place. And of course, this is on the state watchboat, and they're taking a gander at what's going on in terms of their Delaware colleagues that are in close range. Finally, to finish up, is to talk a little bit about the final phase that I'm looking at, and this is when the New Deal photographers show up. And they do a lot of photography in Cumberland County, again, a lot of agriculture, right? So they're doing work up and down the Bayshore, not just the Bayshore, but in other areas as well. But of course, they come to Bivalve, Port Norris, and Shell Pile. And, you know, a lot of times folks a lot of the New Deal FSA photography, you know, is pretty vanilla. You know, there were so many environmental problems that the New Deal was trying to deal with, and not just in terms of very visible environmental degradation, but also the impact on people's lives. And that was the purpose of these photographic surveys. They also wanted to look at, you know, these sort of ancillary things such as living conditions. And as you folks know, living conditions in Shell Pile aren't great. The company housing that existed for the Shuckers. And so Arthur Rothstein right here showed up, and of all the photography he did, he probably did more photography of Shell Pile's housing than anywhere else in the shucking houses. So this is kind of where now we're kind of getting into environmental politics, social justice issues that are kind of entering into the, so you see where we've gone. We've kind of gone from romanticism all the way up to a little bit more edgy photography that's looking at social issues that were at the forefront of the 1930s and the economic and social problems that came out of that era, right? And this is where I'm kind of finishing up. This photograph actually has as a caption, if you go to the Library of Congress website, saying how these areas are breeding grounds for mosquitoes and such, and as you know, standing water is always a breeding ground for mosquitoes. But nonetheless, they comment. So there was social commentary attached. They weren't just taking them for the sake of showing up and wasting film. There was an agenda. That's it. Thank you for listening. Questions, I'll attempt to answer.
Well, you're making me think. I grabbed a lamp from a dark room with a red thing on it, and it had a candle, and I'm sure she told me she made her own postcards.
Yes.
Is that something that?
Yes, they do.
And would they have their names on them? Like, could I look on eBay for them?
No.
What was the South Jersey Institute?
High school?
Oh, high school?
Yeah.
That's what they call high schools back then?
Yeah. I mean, because they didn't exist. Public education was not. It was out there, but it wasn't universal. But yeah, there was. Was it the South Jersey? Let's see. There's the South Jersey Institute. There's the Bridgeton Academy, right? One of them had kind of a military.
West Jersey Academy,
West Jersey.
South Jersey Institute,
South Jersey, West Jersey.
and
Ivy Manor.
Ivy Hall.
Ivy Hall, yeah. But I was interested because actually, I bought it from your mom. Actually, I have a copy of Where Rolls the Oregon. Dallas Lord Sharp made a trip out to Oregon to visit William Finley, who was one of America's first official state conservation officers, and he was involved in the Nature Education Association, as was Hal Bowman. They were both from California originally. They both met at Berkeley, UC Berkeley, and then they went up, and then Finley ends up going to Oregon, getting a job, and through the Nature Education Association, I assume, that is how, because I knew they were both involved, Dallas Lord Sharp goes out to Oregon, takes his son with him, and some of the photographs that William Finley and Hal Bowman took, which they worked together, show Dallas Lord Sharp. Those photographs are at the Oregon Historical Society in Portland. Great, and in fact, I once was in correspondence with Worth Matheson, who's an author who did a book on William Finley's photography, and I called him, and he said, "Where are you calling from?" And I told him where, and he said, "You know Dallas Lord Sharp?" I said, "Yeah, of course I do." He said, "Oh yeah." I said, Where rolls the Oregon?" I said, "Yeah." He goes, "Yeah." I said, "I saw the photographs in the book." He said, so this was a guy from the West Coast who was totally conversant with Dallas Lord Sharp and his network. So, yeah. But the book that I bought for Mrs. Watson years ago it belonged to Cora Sheppard, and it's signed by Dallas Lord Sharp. So I love, I love having that. So it says, what's he say? Here's to Institute days, is what he says, and it's they were both classmates. They were same time period. It was a great line, But if you saw her writing, you could see where those two were simpatico. I mean, and she actually, Cora Sheppard actually did a book review of Wildlife Near Home, and I forget, I don't know what publication it appeared in, but so she reviewed the book. I don't know where, but I have the clipping, but I don't have where it appeared.
Mike, the last photograph you showed, was that a duplex, or were people?
It was
one family,
yeah.
right, but was one family living above the other?
I don't know.
'Cause I know at Whitesbog, they had,
Two
the Italians that came down from South Philadelphia had basically one room. So it'd be one family on one floor, one.
On the second story, yeah. I don't know.
Because with those little balconies, it looked like they were trying to.
Right.
Give them some airspace.
Yeah.
And to be quite honest, it was, as you know, they were torn down in the late 70s. They just leveled all of them, and there was so much bad press over the years that members of the African American community there didn't really want to talk about it. When I tried to ask them questions about It was like, we don't want to go, they just didn't want to go there. Their feelings had been hurt, they just didn't want, so it's kind of, because I was like you, like to your question, I was intrigued at like, why did you use the space? Like, what was it like? You know, and it just was not a topic they wanted to, but I hold out hope there could be somebody. There's actually, those one-story structures, there are actually a collection of those that are buried. If you know 553, it's on the, between Dragston and Port Nars, they're in the woods, and somebody moved them there. They cut them up, they were all connected, and somebody cut them up in sections and put like 4 on one side and 4 on the other. And I was trying to get the Bayshore Center to maybe get one of them and restore them and do something with it and interpret Shucker life.
Are they inhabited?
No.
Are they still there today?
Yeah.
What?
You have to know where they are.
I know where Dragston is and.
Yeah, it was Strawberry Lane. If you're going down 553, you make a right-hand turn, just as you're going out of town. But you wouldn't know they're back there. You have to, now it's overgrown, but they're back there. Start poking around, you know. And those architecture people have, you know, you kind of feel like you're taking your life in your hands sometimes.
Like you said, they were company-owned houses?
They were owned by the shucking houses. So they were owned by Miller and Hollinger. They were owned by McNanny Company. They were owned by the respective shucking operations that arrived in the 1920s. Shucking kind of comes late to the Delaware Bay in comparison to some of the other areas. You know, it was already entrenched in but part of that was because of sanitation. You know, the floating of oysters was fine as long as, and really, they didn't have much problems with E. coli problems and salmonella, you know, but the federal authorities and state authorities got queasier and queasier about it, so I think that kind of pushed, by 1920, that, you know, the Delaware Bay oyster folks to start looking into actually building a shucking house where you shuck the oysters, and then basically you blow water, you wash the oysters basically, so you wash the impurities out of them at that point. And you also fatten them up, that's another thing that happened. So you're getting some of the same effects of floating them, only at this point you're doing it through fresh water and not getting any sort of excrement or bacteria from excrement into the actual oysters, because oysters are filter feeders, and you would ingest that. Other questions? Thank you, good questions. I hope the visuals give you, it's good visual material. You have to, it's, in and of itself, it's pretty compelling. So.
You have enough material there for a book, really.
Yeah, you know, that's the thing, is doing the appropriate contextualization of each of them is what I'd like to do, you know. But I think that just getting the images out, I mean, that's the value, you know. There's this whole debate. If you do material, I say material culture, that's a term we use for those of us who do history using artifacts. And, you know, there's some historians who think that that's, some, thank goodness they're fading, but they don't quite get it. They think it's a little lightweight. But, well, the reality is, as you know, everybody produces material objects. They cook, they sew, they make things, or they use things, and so, you know, the material like this is really useful, doing that sort of thing and getting an understanding. So, you know, just.
May I ask you about your college? It's got a rather intriguing name.
Oh yeah, it's named after it's named after the Native American group in the area. And there's a river that goes, the Quinnipiac River.
Where is it?
It goes, the Quinnipiac River goes north-south, and it goes down and empties into Long Island Sound at New Haven. Hamden's the next town north of New Haven. But I taught in Michigan, at Western Michigan for 16 years at Kalamazoo. So I was there for, I did time. I taught at Washington College in Maryland briefly as well. At Quinnipiac, so the poll has nothing to do with anything academic either. It's a total promotional item for all you watch the news. They do that. That's a total self-contained operation for promotional purposes, and it gets pretty effective, I guess. But the political science students don't get much benefit from it. That's for sure.
Could you tell us a little bit about your sabbatical project?
It's on the Delaware. It's really looking at the environmental and cultural history of the Delaware Bay, which I've been working on for years, but never. I got diverted doing other projects, and so now that's the idea. Is I've got the research done pretty much. It's just a matter of making. I mean, I've got chapters sort of outlined, and what I want to deal with in each one in terms of how the industry sort of. And, I mean, you see material like this could be used in it, but I think you get into problems with academic publishing, believe it or not, you can't have books be too long. I have to publish in academic forums where I won't get, people will look askance. It has to be peer reviewed. And believe it or not, unless you're a heavyweight, the presses get real persnickety about length. And so, yeah, believe it or not, in spite of what you see on the shelf sometimes, usually if you're a heavy hitter and you've got contacts and prestige, yeah, they'll publish a book that thick, but they keep it, they want to keep it to 200, 250, 300 pages, they don't. And when you get into visuals, it gets even more complicated. That's the problem. That's where the book idea is great, but I would need to find a foundation or somebody to help with the subvention, because if a particular publisher, it's expensive to publish images. I mean, I've got the article I got coming out on that you guys helped me with. I've got 27 images, but that's a unique publication because our organization's agreement with the University of Minnesota Press dictates that we get that leeway. Because you can't do architectural, and if you can't do architectural landscape history without images. You need it, so. But that gets expensive. So you'd be amazed. I mean, some publishers are horrible. I know people have done visually oriented projects. We'll give you 7 images. It's like 7 images. It's a 300-page book. Cut me a break. It's like, and what do you do? It's like, don't give me anything, man. I don't know. It's that complicated, but. When I've looked at certain books, the first thing we say when my colleagues were at a conference and we're looking at the book displays, we say, now, how did they swing this deal? How did they get that many images? The first thing you say, they gave us a $15,000 subvention for that. And you can get those. You can go to a foundation or a granting agency and they'll help you with that sort of thing. But it's competitive, of course.
Have you gone through the Graham Schofield collection at the State Library?
Yeah.
Because last thing I knew, it wasn't cataloged.
No. In fact, one time I was there, they asked me, they said, you know what this stuff is, right? Would you mind like writing down what it is? I said, man, I'm not, whenever you do archival research, you're under a time constraint. I said, if I had nothing else to do, I'd be more than happy, but yeah.
And was there anything at Hagley?
There are materials at Hagley. They're materials that are from, as Penny knows, they're from the railroads.
Oh, railroads, not Oyster.
It's Oyster. Well, the railroads built the shipping sheds,
right.
So their records that pertain to those structures are there.
And there is a picture someplace with Harvey Porch's office in the shipping shed.
I've never seen it.
It's here.
Oh, it's here? Yeah.
He's got his little, there's maybe 5 identifying things in one of the porch.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll check that out, yeah. Last time I was looking at the Porch collection, I was very targeted. I was looking for certain things, but I'd like to see that, yeah. That photograph, I don't know if that's in the Porch collection here or not. I got that from an old timer.
I haven't seen that one, the wagon in the house. I haven't seen that one.
That was from Billy Biggs, who was a longtime port in ours. The Bayshore Center owns it now. Well, I got it from, I had the copy stand work done, and it's an actual, print. It's not from a negative. Yes, sir.
Do you have photographs of the trains coming into and leaving Byvale?
Yeah. They're pretty common. Pretty common. That whole story's kind of fat. As you probably know this, there was a whole complex across the river, and that was called Morris River. That part of Morris River Township is actually what it's a part of. But if you're at Byvale today, you look right across the way from the shipping sheds, there was a complex there, and that was built by the West Jersey and Seashore Railroad, which was a subsidiary of the Pennsylvania Railroad. And they connect up and go up. Their route sort of follows Delsea Drive. The Central Railroad of New Jersey that came into Byvale was coming down on a tangent from basically the New York metropolitan area. It came down through Monmouth County, through Burlington County, and then crossed over Camden County at Winslow Junction and made its way to Bridgeton. So that's coming down from that angle, whereas if you looked at the contour of the Delaware River and Delaware Bay, the West Jersey Seashore Railroad is kind of hugging those counties in there, whereas the Jersey Central. So basically, the Pennsylvania Railroad, they wanted to have wanted to be probably better able to serve the Philadelphia market because their depots were in Camden and in Philadelphia, whereas the Central Railroad's going up to New York City. But you could also ship on the Central Railroad, New Jersey, and get your stuff to market in Philadelphia as well. But this was a more direct Philadelphia line. That's fascinating too. Years ago, you could go over there and poke around. If the tide was right, you might find some old, remnants of what was there over Mars River. I used to be able to ride the berm or ride the dike all the way out there. I'm not sure if you can do it now, but that was years ago. I did that once. Interesting stuff.
So from the Mars River side of the river, the oysters would go to Philadelphia, basically?
Yeah.
Okay.
They're going to go up through Bridgeton. Both lines are going up through Bridgeton. The Central Railroad of New Jersey actually went all the way to Bayside. That was the line that took, so they had a spur that went from Bridgeton into Bayside, Greenwich, Bayside, and then they had the other line went from Bridgeton right down 553 basically, into Port Norris. And that was the Jersey Central, again in New York. See, those railroads had incredible political clout in New Jersey. I mean, for years, in the 1880s, 1890s, they really had a tremendous amount of, there was always complaints by New Jersey that they weren't paying their fair share in terms of taxes, and they had tremendous political power, not surprisingly, given how they did. One of the things about Cumberland County that's fascinating is that, as this area is basically pretty sleepy up until the railroads arrived in the 1870s. That's a constant thing I see in my research is that the railroads, to use the marine resources of this region, which again, the farming's a little more marginal once you get below Greenwich. Greenwich was the most, in the 18th century, but Greenwich is at the bottom tier of the intercoastal plain, so the farming's still viable. But once you get below Greenwich, the farming starts to become a little, and below Cedarville, it really gets marginal. You can raise things, but you're not going to be as prolific as all those other counties, like going through areas of Salem County all the way up into Burlington. And so to be able to sort of maximize the economic opportunity here, the railroads were really important in terms of, the newspapers say things like, finally, Lower Jersey is liberated. And a lot of that was because of a lot of the hoopla and the expectations for what the railroads were going to provide for the region. It's pretty. I'm not a big railroad buff. I study railroads to the degree that I need to understand them as catalysts for, for the kind of transformations that they put in motion. But as some people are huge railroad people.
I used to ride in the engine from Woodstown to Salem, through the Salem swamp. Like at night, I'd be riding in the engine, and the headlight would go out 300 feet. And you'd see all Luna moths come in out of the swamp into the headlight. They were attracted by the light.
Oh my gosh.
I don't know if they moved the Oysters on that line years ago in the 1800s.
Woodstown to Salem?
Yes. A friend of mine owned the short line from Woodstown to Salem.
Yeah, see, I don't know some of the details of, again, at Winslow Junction, you can move things effectively at that point up towards Philadelphia on the Jersey Central, but you could also do the same thing at Bridgeton if you had to. You could have, transshipped stuff from there on the Jersey Central onto another line and get it up to Philadelphia as well. So I don't know all the.
I photographed the Winslow train station. I got lost, totally lost. I was driving a 1949 Chrysler with fluid drive. And I'm in the Pine Barrens. I couldn't find my way out. And nothing, miles and miles and miles of nothing but woods. And all of a sudden I come into Winslow, and here's this beautiful train station in the middle of nowhere.
Right.
And I photographed it and with the Chrysler. And eventually found my way out somehow. I just kept driving, I guess, till I got out of Pine Barrens. But after that, somebody burned the train station down. But it was a beautiful train station.
Yeah, all the old timers in Port Norris used to talk, who worked on the railroads, used to talk about Winslow Junction. So again, you know more about it than I do. But they always would talk about that, going, making that run from Winslow Junction down to Port Norris. That was a big deal. So I guess that must be why, it's, particularly when you're going through the Pine Barrens and that during that era when things were pretty sleepy, right? I'm
Yes.
not sure all of a sudden this civilization, right? Of course, you guys would be happy to know, since the circles that I deal in, people are always intrigued about what they consider sort of the boondocks of Cumberland County. They come down here and they're like shocked. You might think that they were Lewis and Clark. It's always funny, their response, like they say, you know about that place? I said, well, I do research down there, so yeah, I know about it. Yeah, I was down there. It's like, they're like, really, I put the coonskin hat on them. But they have these reactions, that are kind of interesting, and, but I guess it's one of the interesting, again, I'm not trying to sound like I'm sort of anti-modern, but that's one that, I always hope that, because I just think of it, in environmental studies circles, we always talk about food security today, and one time I was driving last summer through Salem County, through Alloway, I was looking at these farm fields, and I said, why would we want to develop that when it's a food supply that if something, God forbid, happened, at least we'd have some food produced nearby, rather than making it attract housing development. It's like, why would we do that, So I always, I'm not trying to sound like I'm against development or building, or I'd be able to make a living, I know, but sometimes I just say to myself, gee.
But in Europe, they've already started that. In Tuscany, if you own a farm, you cannot build another house on that farm. Your kids have to live in the addition to your farmhouse as a married couple. There are no place in Tuscany can you build on farmland because they recognize that kind of thing.
Yeah, well, I always say when I teach environmental history, the Europeans had their Jesus moment years ago, and they realized that the ecology, it's a smaller landmass, and they realize they've got less to deal with, so they have to be more prudent. Around here, you tell people some of these planting things, they think you're a communist. I brought up something one day. I play adult ice hockey, and I was playing one day, and these guys were talking. They said something about the Finnish healthcare system. Yeah, but they get taxed to death. I said, yeah, but everybody does have health care. I said, we won't even go there. Right? But you're right. In terms of issues of land use planning, they're much
more progressive.
Yeah, people in America always think that they think it's horrific, but it's actually.
So my mother lived not directly across, but close to Cora Sheppard from 1929 until she left her whole family home. And she didn't know she was married.
See? Well, that's because if you look at the oh gosh, he's not here. Belford Blackman's not here, is he? Or is Belford even still with us? Belford Black, you guys know Belford?
Oh, I think he passed away.
Did he pass away? No, this is the son.
Oh.
This is the son, Belford. Yeah, Belford would be in his 80s now, but one time we were talking about, I did all this research on Port Norris, and you might have thought that I was, who's those gossip columnists from the New York papers? I knew all these details about Port Norris, and he said, boy, it's like, like a soap opera. I said, well, I just do research on it, that's how I know it. I mean, it's no big deal, But I forget how it came up. I know how it came up, because when I was in the cemetery looking for her tombstone, it doesn't have Lupton. It says Cora Sheppard. So I asked some folks, and they said, well, she and Arch kind of, and I looked at the census, in 1940, they're not living together. So I don't know if they actually divorced or not, but I'm not sitting here making
No,
judgment.
it's just, when you said Lupton, I knew she'd been married, but I didn't know who she'd been married to.
Yeah, he was a postman. He delivered the mail, and which is kind of interesting because Harvey Porch was a postman. But you could tell, and her father, who her father was, Caleb Shepard, famous abolitionist. I mean, that's another guy, another interesting story. Member of the state senate, who was. I began to see this. I said to the family member, now I'm starting to see the lineage here. This guy's he's out in front of abolition before it's fashionable in a state where people weren't always terribly sympathetic to abolition. So he was an active abolitionist, and then he has a daughter who's pretty plucky.
But the Republican Party was started in Shiloh, in Cumberland County.
Right.
Why?
Yeah.
Yeah,
1859.
yeah. So they had both sides of that
Yeah.
equation. Also, the head of the KKK was in Shiloh at the time.
Not
And
too long ago.
the park, Tumbling Dam Park, the building was built by the KKK. And is it Harvey Renfrew? Bought it from them after he'd worked for them.
Okay.
They were out of favor.
I know that when the first African Americans showed up in Port Norris in the 1890s, they were met by the KKK. The paper refers to them as the Whitecaps, and because they thought that these guys, African Americans, were going to take their jobs.
Right.
The reality was there was always a labor shortage. They didn't have enough crew, so they needed to bring people in to help before the shucking houses were built. So the African American, in fact, what's interesting about Port Norris is African Americans are actually somewhat integrated into the community in the 1890s and the first decade of the 20th century. It's only till later that they kind of get sequestered out at a shell pile. So when they first come up, they're actually, again, I'm not going to say they're fully integrated, but they're in the town of Port Norris. And but again, if you talk to a lot of the old timers, they'll tell you.
They were integrated here. There were blocks that went to Bacon's Neck School, and even though they had their own school in Springtown, that was the primary school, and then they were integrated in the upper grades.
I had black friends in Monroeville. The Bridgeton train went through their property. And the man told me he bought the 52 acres. A black person wasn't allowed to own property in New Jersey until 1937. And that's when he bought the 52 acres. And it was all swamp land. There was one little hill in the middle of the 52 acres, and that's where he built his house. But the train went off to the one side of the house, and his kids used to wave to the steam trains, and the engineer would blow the whistle, to make the kids happy.
Yeah.
Well, Ward didn't have any children, but he was married to a Myers, and there are Myers still in the area. I don't know if they have any photographs or anything.
Right.
Yeah, they had quite a plenty.
When did you start to focus on the Delaware Bay?
I got diverted when I was working on my doctoral dissertation. I was interested in that. I was always interested in maritime. I first went to Port Norris. I was in Sea Scouts when I was a kid. We went down to Five Elk when I was a kid. I remember going out in the boats, and I was fascinated by the shell piles. And so I was always interested in maritime communities, in the maritime places, particularly the interface of buildings and boats and everything comes together. And I'm just interested in people that use natural resources. So I got interested back in 89, and then I met Megan Wren and I got involved helping out with the restoration of the Mirwald. And I've been involved in one way, shape, or another with that. I've helped those folks out over the years in a lot of projects, and I still do. That's how but it's kind of interesting because I just did an encyclopedia entry for the Delaware Bay for this Encyclopedia of Greater Philadelphia that Rutgers is putting out. It's an online publication. And, it's the Delaware Bay really gets overlooked. Everybody, I get so sick and tired, it drives me nuts. My colleagues introduce me. Here's Michael Chiarappa. He's interested in Chesapeake Bay. I said, well, I am interested in Chesapeake Bay, but I studied the Delaware Bay. Why do you always do this? Is this place that obscure? They're always doing that. I said,
It's always had great press, that Chesapeake Bay.
oh, I know. Well,
Despite the fact that we supply their oysters.
And of course, lots of cultural connections between the areas, even the accents, right? But it's, that really dominates the narrative. The thing that's interesting, I'm sorry, I'll shut up. The thing that's fascinating about Delaware Bay oystering, I always find, is that you had three scientists who wanted to privatize the oyster grounds. When this starts in the 1870s and 1880s, they basically want to take natural oyster grounds that exist, and they exist out here, and they want to go to people and say, we're going to lease or we're going to allow you to buy the rights to this ground. Now, some of the scientists think this is going to be great because it'll provide you with if you buy it or if you lease it, the incentives you'll take care of it, right? Well, in the Chesapeake, they freak out. Even though William Keith Brooks is a famous scientist who the Delaware Bay scientists studied under, he's at Johns Hopkins, he thinks it'll be a good idea, but the Chesapeake Bay oystermen go nuts. They say, no way. All that's going to do is lead to corporate consolidation. And on one level, they're right. They say, because if you have more money, you'll be able to buy up all the oyster grounds. And so they never went to a planning system there. I mean, it was a free-for-all. You go out, you go to the natural grounds, you dredge your oysters, you take them to market. Up in New England and on the Long Island Sound, you could actually buy or lease natural oyster grounds, which meant that's great. There's a naturally productive oyster bed that you have sole proprietorship over. In New Jersey, we struck a balance. We basically said, the state's going to control the natural beds, we're going to lease to you bay bottom that's barren. So Marsh River Cove, those areas that were leased out, there's no natural oyster growth on. Now you always hope that maybe you'll plant your oysters and maybe you'll get, but that's what Al Hubbard did. He was involved in that, if you ever saw the maps, that labyrinth of how oyster, they were supposed to put stakes on each corner so that you knew, but that was, so we kind of struck a balance. We did privatize, and at one point, the New Jersey Riparian Commission in the 1892-93 actually sold Bay Bottom off of Fortescue to 3 different oystermen, and there was an oyster war. Oh yeah, they were shooting, because the rest of the oystermen said, no way, we all use this. And ultimately, those guys who had purchased those rights from the Riparian Commission backed off, the state bought them back, and it became a common property of the citizens of New Jersey. So I always thought it was interesting that we kind of struck a middle ground. We're going to privatize, but only on bay bottom that's barren, and you can transplant the oysters. Whereas in other areas, they totally rejected that, and in other areas, they actually embraced a certain level of privatization, which I think is, so I always thought that that's going to be kind of a theme of the book.
And moving into the future, what do you think the aquaculture of, raising oysters is going to do to this whole...
They're doing some interesting things. At first I was dubious, but they're doing some cool stuff. Yeah. There's a guy down there at Cape Atlantic, goes to Cape Atlantic, but the Cape May salts oysters. He's actually a Haddonfield native. I gave a talk on oyster, not this talk. I gave a talk on oystering in Haddonfield. This woman showed up. She said, "I never come to talks like this." She said, "I never come to these." And I said, "Okay." She said, "But my son works down there. I wanted to find out what was going on." Oh, okay. I said, "Well, there it is. History does provide there's some utility, And so I said, "Well, I want to meet your son. He's like 30 years old. He just, through happenstance, people left the job, and so they're raising the oysters on the flats down in Cape May County, and they're actually raising them off of Fortescue in big cages that are off the, see oysters, on the that's why they need to be off the bottom so they're not suffocated by mud. So they're raising them in these cages, but they're actually doing stuff like they pull the cages up, they tumble them, to take, so they're actually cultivating the shape of the oyster to a degree, because certain oyster bars want a particular appearance of the oyster to leave its size. They brought in a device from Australia, used it in Cape May County. The water was going through it, it was working, and the oysters that came out were like practically round. They said, recent oyster looked like a meatball. They said, really? I said, yeah, we can't sell those. Nobody wants those. I said, so they thought, well, so she was showing me some of the equipment. Yeah, we use this and we use that. So they're using disease-resistant oysters, which are being produced by hatcheries in New England and the Chesapeake. So you're buying your seed. They raise the seed to plantable size, and then they plant it either on the flats or off of Fortescue. That one operation. But it looks like it could be. It seems more boutique-ish on one level, but it's who knows,
But there's some conflict between that and the shorebird and horseshoe crab migration, isn't there?
Yeah, I don't. Probably not in the area where they are. We're further down. I'm not sure. This is I know what you're talking about. Not in this area, I would doubt. Given, but who knows? Maybe I'll ask them when I see them next time. I want to get back down and see them.
Unless they're blocking the beach.
It's a long stretch. Those flats areas are in Cape May County. It looks pretty wild. You walk up on that berm and then look out, and it's just at low tide. You can walk way out. It's pretty interesting. But again, it's labor intensive because they're out there with high-powered hoses, getting the mud off the oysters, because you don't, again, so you do have to tend them. They've got them lined up in rows, so when you look at them out there, you'll see all these, they're about that high off the bay bottom, and they've got them like first years, second years, third years, these are in market, you know, so it's a system. The Europeans have been doing this for years. They're the French and the Dutch and so forth. So they, but yeah, it's a capital outlay. You know, it's like raising cranberries and you're not going to get a crop immediately, right? It takes a while.
Might be better.
I'm sorry.
No, that's fine.
You're a great audience.
I got into the oyster industry.
I'm sorry. Thanks, folks.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you.